Hey there, friend. It's time to wind down, unplug, and wander into the strange, buttoned-up world of long-ago Britain. But don't worry, this isn't the kind of history that asks you to remember dates or battle names. No, this is the kind of story best heard with the lights low, a cup of something warm, and maybe a blanket pulled up to your chin. Tonight, we're rolling back the velvet curtains of time, stepping gently into an age where chimney sweeps were still a thing, trousers were suspiciously tight, and the best behaved children might have learned their manners from a squirrel. Yes, a squirrel. You see, the Victorians had some very specific ideas about proper behavior. And some of them thought that animals, especially small ones with busy hands and twitchy noses, could teach children how to be better humans. It sounds ridiculous. It is ridiculous. But it also happened. So tonight, we're going to explore how pet squirrels, and other equally curious companions, became miniature moral compasses in nurseries lined with lace and wallpapered in pastel gilt. Along the way, we'll meet etiquette authors who wrote serious treatises about chewing quietly, governesses who cried over dropped forks, and very polite rodents wearing tiny waistcoats. We'll peek inside drawing rooms, schoolrooms, and even squirrel cages, gently unfolding one soft, peculiar layer of history at a time. But don't worry, you don't need to stay wide awake to enjoy this. If your eyes start to close, that's exactly what they're supposed to do. This is history told with a yawn, not a shout. So get comfortable. Let your thoughts slow down. And before we begin, let me ask you something. Where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it where you are right now? Because I have a feeling, no matter where you are, you and we've got the same little nighttime ritual. Tonight, we drift softly into the world of corsets, crumpets, and curtsies, a time when a child could be scolded for slouching, praised for sitting perfectly still, and occasionally, assigned a squirrel as a moral tutor. Yes, a squirrel. But before we giggle or shrug it off as yet another eccentricity of the past, let's do what we always do here, slow everything down. Unlace the tight boots of modern logic. Lay your head back. Loosen your grip on the world of deadlines and noise. We're slipping into the parlor of a tidy Victorian home, the kind with lace doilies on every surface and faint smells of lavender water lingering in the curtains. Outside, gas lamps flicker and fog curls like lazy ghosts across cobbled streets. Inside, a governess whispers, "Sit straight, Edwin, and mind the squirrel." Let's back up. It's the late 1800s in England. Queen Victoria reigns over a society obsessed with propriety, appearances, and above all else, behavior. The upper middle class, in particular, is gripped by an anxious desire to appear refined. Not noble by birth, they aim to be noble by manners. So how, exactly, did squirrels end up on the syllabus? We'll get there. But first, we need to understand just how serious the Victorians were about child rearing. In a society where children were seen as miniature adults, expected to dine, bow, and hold conversations without a hint of mischief, any tool that could teach grace, gentleness, or patience was considered useful. And for some, no tutor was quite as effective, or amusing, as a fluffy-tailed, not-burying rodent with impeccable posture and a deep hatred of sudden movements. Pet squirrels, surprisingly, were once a common sight in British parlors. But not as modern pets are, they weren't meant for cuddling or spoiling. These were living lessons in restraint. Imagine, you're a young boy in a tidy grey waistcoat. Your governess places a squirrel cage beside you and says, "Now, Edwin, remain calm and still. If you flinch, he won't come near you." The game begins. The squirrel, sleek and alert, peers at you from behind the brass bars. He knows exactly what he's doing. One wrong move, a fidget, a twitch, and he scampers back into his box. But if you're quiet, if you're gentle, if you're truly composed, he might approach. He might eat from your hand. And in that moment, you learn a lesson no lecture could teach. Stillness is rewarded. Gentleness brings trust. In this way, pet squirrels were more than just novelty. They were behavioral barometers, small fuzzy judges of a child's composure. To succeed, you had to master your energy, your impulses, your desire to grab or laugh or wiggle. You had to become, in a word, Victorian. Of course, not all families went this route. But among the more imaginative, or possibly more desperate, parents and governesses, it was a surprisingly effective trick. And it wasn't just squirrels. Some families employed birds. Others used tortoises. One story even mentions a bad-tempered ferret, though that ended poorly for everyone involved. Still, there's something beautifully odd about the squirrel, a creature associated with mischief being used to instill discipline. It's the sort of upside-down logic the Victorians excelled at. And the children, for the most part, took it seriously. Diaries from the era mention Mr. Thistlewisk, or Lady Walnut, pets who demanded courtesy and inspired affection. One girl wrote that she whispered secrets to her squirrel and swore he nodded in approval. Another claimed her squirrel helped her learn to sit through an entire sermon without squirming, a feat she later described as the greatest agony of my 8th year. It's easy to laugh. But maybe we shouldn't. Maybe, in their quiet way, these little animals were doing what even the most well-meaning adult couldn't, offering companionship that rewarded calmness, inviting stillness with the promise of closeness. And in a world where children were rarely indulged, rarely allowed to be loud or messy or free, a squirrel's trust may have felt like a small and precious rebellion. Coming up next, the curious roles of Victorian table manners, why dropping a fork was considered a crisis, and how napkins were folded into 36 different shapes. But for now, take a deep breath. Let your shoulders drop. And before we continue, tell me, where in the world are you listening to my story from? And what time is it for you right now? Because I have a feeling, people everywhere, no matter the hour, love this strange and sleepy kind of history just like you do. Let's imagine a small drawing room in a well-to-do Victorian home. The air smells faintly of coal smoke and lavender polish. There's a boy, maybe 6 years old, seated stiffly on a chair that's just a bit too high for his short legs. His shoes are shiny. His collar is starched. And beside him, on a velvet footstool, is Clarence. Clarence is a squirrel. Not a toy. Not a statue. A real squirrel. With twitchy ears, a bushy tail, and the sort of judgmental stare that only squirrels and old librarians seem to possess. And Clarence has a job to do. You see, in some upper-class Victorian households, squirrels were part of a peculiar behavioral experiment. Inspired by the belief that animals, if trained properly, could exhibit ideal manners, some well-meaning, and very imaginative, parents brought small creatures into the home as refinement companions. If you slouched, Clarence scolded you, in his own squirrel way. If you reached for cake before the guest did, Clarence might leap onto the table in a flurry of disapproval. And heaven help you if you talked with your mouth full. The squirrel might actually turn its back on you. A social death, in miniature. Why squirrels, you ask? Because they were considered both wild and wise. They could be trained, but only by the truly disciplined. And if a child could earn the affection of a squirrel, could feed it gently, sit still while it perched on one's shoulder, surely that child could also learn restraint, patience, and respect. In books of the time, there were even illustrated guides showing the proper conduct between child and pet, with curious titles like Clarence, or The Virtue of Stillness, and The Whispering Nut, squirrel dialogues for the young mind. Of course, not every household had a live squirrel roaming the parlor, but the idea spread. In middle-class homes, toy squirrels made of stiff felt and glass eyes were used in similar ways, as behavioral props. Clarence is watching, a governess might say, tapping the toy's tiny head. And somehow, the room would fall silent. This fusion of morality, nature, and childhood etiquette was very Victorian. It spoke to a deep belief in the perfectibility of the child, and of the animal world as a model, if one only paid close attention. Children were taught to mirror the squirrel's grace, to move softly, to listen before acting, and to store good habits as squirrels stored nuts. It may seem absurd now, but for many families, Clarence the squirrel became a household name, a symbol of polite society in miniature. And isn't that the magic of the age? that something as wild and flighty as a squirrel could become a tutor in manners? But of course, Clarence wasn't the only teacher. In the next part, we'll visit the strange world of the Victorian politeness academies, private finishing schools for children as young as 5, where students learn not just when to speak, but how to exist. Coming up next. Please and thank you or else, inside a Victorian manners school. Stay with me. It was a quiet afternoon in Sussex. The kind of day where the fog didn't lift until after tea, and the only real excitement was whether the milk delivery boy would remember to close the gate. In the drawing room of the Belgrave household, little Emily sat upright, her hands folded just so, her eyes focused not on the governess, nor on her needlework, but on a small, twitchy creature perched delicately on a walnut-sized wooden chair, Nutkins the squirrel. Nutkins was not just a family pet. Oh no. He was a moral compass, a mirror, and a living lesson in restraint. And today, as Emily gently pushed a crumb of biscuit across a tiny china plate toward the creature, she was expected to observe everything. How Nutkins nibbled with precision. How he wiped his face with his paws after the meal. How he paused, as if contemplating the etiquette of a second helping. The Victorians believed that small animals, if well behaved, could instill discipline in children more effectively than any tutor. A squirrel, it was thought, did not need to be scolded. It simply needed to be watched. And thus children watched how a squirrel reacted to noise, poorly, to rough hands, with fury, and to loud voices, with rapid escape. Children quickly learned to whisper. They learned to move slowly. They learned that the world was full of creatures more delicate than themselves, and in the mind of a stern Victorian parent, that was the foundation of character. But the squirrel was not always cooperative. One Thursday, during elocution hour, Nutkins launched himself from the windowsill onto the freshly combed hair of Master Reginald, who shrieked and spilled a bowl of ink over his trousers. The governess did not punish the squirrel. She praised Reginald for remaining mostly still during the incident. Composure in the face of chaos. She noted in her diary that evening, is the mark of an English gentleman. Squirrel manners were more than a potty trick. They were part of a larger Victorian obsession with order, with controlling the self through external rituals. By watching a squirrel dine with grace, children were encouraged to reflect on their own table behavior. Some families even commissioned miniature furniture, full dining sets, silver cutlery barely the length of a pinky finger, all for the squirrel. These tableaux were arranged at mealtimes to mirror the family's own supper table, and children were expected to match the squirrel's movements: nibble, pause, wipe, sip. If the squirrel drank politely, so should you. If the squirrel did not throw a tantrum when given the smaller biscuit, then neither should you. And when the squirrel scurried away with one half of a crumpet, children were taught the ultimate Victorian virtue, restraint. Nutkins has taken his portion, a mother might say. He did not ask for more. That's all it took. Of course, there were accidents. Squirrels are, after all, wild things at heart. In one particularly memorable case in 1874, a pet squirrel named Florence, belonging to the Earl of Dorset's daughter, gnawed through a lace curtain and was discovered sleeping inside a top hat. The butler resigned. The hat was burned. And the young lady learned a valuable lesson. Not even the best-dressed squirrel can resist temptation. But still, the practice spread. Manuals were written. Illustrations were published in women's magazines. And by the turn of the century, the squirrel method had reached as far as Toronto and Calcutta. It was gentle. It was unusual. And it was, by all accounts, highly effective. Because no child wanted to be less dignified than a rodent. Let's wander now into a quiet Victorian drawing room, where the fireplace crackles gently, and the heavy damask curtains muffle the sound of horse hooves outside. Inside, the air is thick with the sweet scent of lavender polish and coal smoke. A grandmother is seated in a high-backed armchair, her eyes drowsy behind round spectacles. But the real star of the afternoon isn't the ticking clock or the tea cart rattling its porcelain dishes. It's Timothy, a squirrel dressed in a velvet waistcoat, perched atop a mahogany side table. You see, for upper-class Victorian children, The drawing room was not just a place for needlework and polite conversation, it was also a stage. And the pet squirrel, if properly trained, could be the centerpiece of an impromptu matinee. These squirrels weren't simply expected to be cute. They were actors, performers, dancers. Victorian manuals on home amusements for children contained entire chapters devoted to entertaining pets for genteel refinement. Squirrels featured prominently. They were praised for their grace, their quick wit, whatever that meant to a Victorian, and their ability to be taught polite behaviors, such as bowing, fetching ribbons, or delicately sipping drops of milk from a child's saucer. Afternoon squirrel performances became informal social events. Families would invite close neighbors over for tea and a show. While adults gossiped about railway stocks and Lord Byron's scandalous poetry, the children would whisper excitedly to one another. "Timothy's going to jump through the paper hoop today. Clarence taught his to curtsy. I heard someone's squirrel fainted once, right in the middle of the sugar cube trick." The animals, no doubt bewildered by the fuss, responded in various ways. Some did indeed perform tricks, simple ones like balancing on spoons or pulling toy carriages. Others, less cooperative, dashed under sofas and had to be coaxed out with raisins. Naturally, not every child was delighted by these expectations. One young girl named Millicent wrote in her diary in 1873, "Mama insists I must teach Percy to walk upon the pianoforte keys. I fear he prefers the curtains, and I do not blame him." The pressure to turn a squirrel into a miniature gentleman or lady was real. It was a reflection of deeper cultural values, order, restraint, spectacle, but also a desire to make even the natural world bend to the will of etiquette. Children who failed to keep their squirrels tame or dignified were not punished, but they were often scolded gently. Such wildness, darling, reflects inward disorder. What must your squirrel think of you? Even in leisure, manners reigned supreme. A spilled saucer or a twitchy tail could trigger lessons on poise. The squirrel, meant to be a vessel of elegance, often reminded children, ironically, their nature cannot always be trimmed to fit a tea tray. Still, not all these moments were rigid or joyless. Some families, especially outside of London, allowed more playful relationships to form. In country homes, squirrels weren't confined to cages or tethers. They darted freely across tabletops, occasionally interrupting needlepoint or knocking over thimbles. And if a child loved their squirrel more as a friend than a performance partner, that too was quietly accepted, so long as no nuts were left on the rug and the squirrel was never invited to dinner. By now, the image is complete. A soft-lit parlor, a child in lace, a squirrel hopping across doilies, the clink of china, the sigh of old upholstery. A performance that was never quite perfect, but somehow always endearing. And what about you? Were you the kind of child who would have taught your squirrel to curtsy? Or would you have simply watched him vanish up the curtain rod? Let's keep going. Now, let us settle into a scene that seems almost too peculiar to be true. A long oak dining table, gleaming with polish and laid out with crisp linen, silver spoons, and delicate china. Around it, small children sit stiffly, backs straight, napkins folded just so, and eyes nervously glancing down the table. Not at the governess, not at their stern father, but at the squirrel. Yes, the squirrel. Because in some elite Victorian households, especially among the more eccentric upper middle classes who adored novel forms of moral education, the family pet wasn't a dog or a cat or even a parrot. It was a squirrel in a little embroidered vest, perched atop a miniature perch beside the child most in need of refinement that week. You see, Victorians loved object lessons. And nothing taught a child not to slurp soup or spill jam like the shame of having a squirrel shake its tiny head at them, or worse, scamper indignantly away. The squirrels, of course, weren't truly trained moralists. But the illusion was powerful. Children believed it. Parents swore by it. Governesses took delight in describing the squirrel's disapproval in colorful detail. "Oh dear, Algernon. Mr. Thistletail looked quite offended by the way you used your fork." One governess in Devon even wrote in her diary that her charge, a 6-year-old named Beatrice, bursting to tears when Pippin the squirrel turned his back on her pudding spoon mishap and refused to take his usual almond. Children developed elaborate theories about what the squirrel liked and disliked. Crumbs on the table? A grave offense. Double dipping in the marmalade? Unforgivable. But offering him a tiny crust of toast or brushing imaginary lint from his fur? That earned you the rarest reward, the squirrel curling up on your sleeve in approval. It became a soft form of gamified discipline. No harsh scolding. No whipping. Just a judgmental rodent silently peering from a lace-trimmed perch. Victorian children, especially those who were otherwise loud, mischievous, or bored by their endless etiquette drills, suddenly had a stake in behaving well. And it wasn't just during meals. Some families extended squirrel sessions to tea time or even bedtime routines. One Yorkshire family reportedly hosted an annual squirrel ball, where children were only allowed to dance if they passed a month of perfect etiquette under the scrutiny of Lord Chesternut, their famously aloof grey squirrel. But not everyone was impressed. Critics claimed that relying on an animal for discipline was a mockery of Christian order, and the London Housekeeper's Journal warned in 1868 that spoiled children now hate squirrels more than sermons. Still, the idea persisted. Why? Because in truth it worked. Or at least, it didn't make things worse. And in a time when children were often punished harshly and early, the notion of a furred friend gently nudging a child toward politeness felt like a small act of progress. In our next chapter, we'll take a walk through the etiquette gardens. Yes, that was a real thing, where young Victorians were taught how to bow, curtsy, and recite Latin aphorisms to a chorus of chirping birds and indifferent hedgehogs. So, you've made it to mid-afternoon in a very average upper-middle-class Victorian home. The piano has been practiced. The embroidery has been stitched. The poetry recitation has been endured. What next? Tea, of course. But not just tea for the children and the tutor, no. Tea for the squirrels, too. In households that took their rodent mirroring seriously, the 4 o'clock hour was more than just a moment for crustless sandwiches and milky Earl Grey. It was a full demonstration of moral discipline, table etiquette, and yes, peanut diplomacy. A child who could offer a shelled walnut to a squirrel without fumbling it, startling the animal, or, heaven forbid, reaching with the left hand was said to be ready for society. That's not an exaggeration. Etiquette books of the period occasionally included a paragraph or two on the conduct of the nursery rodent, which really meant the conduct of the child. One particularly charming excerpt from the Youth's Companion to Christian Civility and Appropriate Pet Keeping, 1873, reads, "A child who shares without command, waits without complaint, and attends without fright as their squirrel takes its bite, shall one day host royalty with equal grace." This was not satire. Not entirely. In a culture where manners meant everything, where a wrong glance at dinner could tank your marriage prospects, the training of empathy, poise, and quiet presence began early, and the squirrel was the perfect test. Think of it, a creature easily startled, nibbling delicately, climbing the lap of the obedient, but occasionally itchy child in a silk collar. If the child could resist sudden giggles or flinching, they might also someday endure a dry sermon, or a disapproving mother-in-law. Some households even developed what they called, not protocol, a rigid structure for who could feed which treat and when. Hazelnuts were reserved for Thursdays. Walnuts were ceremonial. Almonds, an expensive delight, were offered only on holidays or after music exams. If this sounds absurd, consider the Victorian obsession with symbolism. Every gesture, every pause, every serving order carried meaning. The pet squirrel became a mirror of the child's soul. Wild, but educable. Curious, yet capable of restraint. Meanwhile, the squirrels themselves, let us not forget, often had no patience for any of this. Some, no doubt, simply grabbed the nut and bolted up the curtains, tearing silk and chewing tassels as they fled the scene. Others, however, seemed to relish the pageantry, perching with noble posture, brushing their whiskers like gentlemen of the House of Lords. For the children, it was theatre. For the parents, it was pedagogy. For the squirrels, possibly just a very posh snack time. As we wrap up this section and let our fictional child put away their satin gloves, yes, some were required to wear them when handling the squirrels, we must ask ourselves, why all the formality? Why the fuss? Why did a society so famously buttoned up find comfort in the tiny hands of a forest creature? Imagine it's a cool afternoon in a drawing room lined with wallpaper of climbing roses and tiny birds. The sunlight is soft, filtering through lace curtains as the fireplace crackles gently in the corner. A bell rings, tea is served. And entering the room, politely on time and perfectly trained, is a squirrel. In some well-to-do Victorian households, squirrels were not merely pets, they were participants in rituals of gentility. Afternoon tea, a daily ceremony of quiet manners, offered yet another opportunity for children to observe and mimic the discipline expected of them. And who better to demonstrate such fine behavior than their bushy-tailed companions? Victorian manuals of etiquette often encouraged imitation and observation. Children were told to watch the manners of the house, a phrase that extended, quite literally, to any living creature within it. And if your family's pet squirrel sat quietly nibbling a walnut on a porcelain saucer while you slurped your tea or forgot to use your spoon correctly, well, who was the uncivilized one now? These squirrels were trained to sit still, not scratch the table, and to eat tidily, not with hands, of course, but with tiny paws raised delicately. Trainers, usually house servants or the children themselves, used gentle repetition, food incentives, and patient observation. Some squirrels even wore tiny collars with bells that jingled softly, a reminder to stay alert and present, just like the children were expected to be at tea. And yet, tea was not only about refinement. It was also about stories. As the pot was poured and biscuits passed, tales were told of distant relatives, of foggy London streets, of wars far away and wedding announcements in the newspaper. Children learned to listen, nod politely, and never interrupt. The squirrel, in his own way, played a role too, offering a point of amusement or comfort, something to pet quietly while grown-ups conversed. The presence of animals in such formal settings reminded children that gentleness was not just a virtue but a habit. If one could be soft with a skittish animal, one could be soft with people. If a squirrel could be trained not to leap onto the sugar bowl, then surely a child could learn not to complain when served unsweetened tea. Of course, not all squirrels were so cooperative. Some would disappear into folds of curtains or upset entire trays of biscuits in pursuit of a beetle. But even in their mischief, they offered lessons in patience, forgiveness, and the importance of calm reactions. A child who lost their temper at a squirrel's antics might be reminded. That little creature knows no better. But you, my dear, must know better. This gentle anthropomorphism, expecting better of humans because animals weren't held to the same standard, was a hallmark of Victorian child rearing. It wasn't about cruelty or strictness. It was about modeling. And squirrels, oddly enough, were ideal models, dignified when they felt safe, chaotic when provoked, and always entertaining. Next time you picture Victorian children sipping tea in stiff outfits, imagine the squirrel, perched nearby with perfect posture, eyes gleaming, tail curled like a comma at the end of a sentence. Picture a sunlit drawing room in an upper-class Victorian home. The lace curtains filter in soft morning light, dappling the walls with floral shadows. A grandfather clock ticks gently in the background. The fireplace is unlit, for it is spring. And upon a tiny tufted cushion near the piano, a small red squirrel sits upright, grooming its tail like a well-rehearsed actor waiting for a cue. The child seated across from the animal, dressed in a starched pinafore or short velvet jacket, holds a silver spoon with quivering attention. Today's lesson is not just about eating without slurping, it's about not startling one's animal companion. You see, in this household, if you could take tea in peace with the squirrel perched beside your teacup, you were nearly ready for polite society. In the world of Victorian etiquette, the child was not merely expected to behave. They were expected to embody grace under pressure, where the pressure was sometimes a small wild animal who might bolt, nibble, or scurry at the first sign of loud behavior. Etiquette as performance. Victorian homes were silent theaters, and the children were the actors, trained from their earliest days to perform roles of deference, poise, and composure. Every gesture was rehearsed. The way one opened a door, stood when an adult entered the room, or folded a napkin, it all mattered. But more than rules, these rituals were intended to shape inner character, patience, empathy, and control. That's where the squirrels came in. Aristocratic families, especially those keen on showing off their progressive parenting or eccentric refinement, began employing a curious technique inspired by a mix of Enlightenment philosophy and country superstition, placing children in close, supervised contact with tamed woodland animals. The belief? That animals, being sensitive to energy and easily startled, made for the perfect moral barometer. If the child was loud, the squirrel would leap. If the child was cruel, the squirrel would bite. But if the child was calm, kind, and composed, the squirrel might stay, and even accept a treat from their hand. In an age before YouTube parenting channels and child psychologists, this was a kind of living behavioral feedback loop, elegant, silent, and fur-covered. Tiny tailcoats and porcelain bowls. Let's not forget that this was also the era of extreme anthropomorphism. Squirrels, hedgehogs, and even ducks were dressed in tiny waistcoats, invited to dine at doll-sized tables, and featured in moralistic tales told at bedtime. In fact, some parents even commissioned painted portraits of their children and their manor companions, as they were sometimes called. These portraits, found today in dusty attics or eccentric auction catalogs, reveal not just the fashion of the time, but a deep desire to merge nature with nurture, gently, visually, and morally. A favorite tale among governesses involved the girl named Matilda whose squirrel named Bramble refused to sit with her at tea after she had thrown a tantrum the previous morning. Matilda learned her lesson, and by week's end, Bramble returned, gently taking a sugar cube from her hand. It may sound quaint, but in a world where girls were being prepared for drawing room diplomacy and boys for quiet authority, these interactions offered daily training in emotional regulation. And the stakes? A squirrel's companionship, or its silent scorn, the invisible curriculum. Behind every squirrel on the lap lesson was an invisible curriculum, not one of multiplication tables or Latin verbs, but one of restrained grace, and the constant awareness of another living being's comfort. A clumsy move, a loud shriek, or even the wrong scent might undo a week's worth of progress. Some parents even believed that the way an animal responded to a child's presence could predict their suitability for marriage or station. To the modern mind, it sounds absurd. But to the Victorians, it made a quiet kind of sense. They believed that how you treated the least of beings, small animals, servants, even insects, was a mirror of your soul. And so, in homes where silence reigned and expectations hovered like fog, the squirrel was both test and teacher. Next, the garden games of gentle beasts. We've seen how Victorian drawing rooms became classrooms of quiet refinement. But what happened when these well-mannered children were set loose in the garden, with squirrels still in tow? Picture this, a fine spring morning in 1874, in the heart of Bath. The daffodils had just begun to bloom along the neatly trimmed hedgerows, and a warm, buttery light spelled in through the tall windows of the Montague residence. In the drawing room, the furniture was rearranged not for tea or guests, but for something far more peculiar, a squirrel's soiree. Yes, you heard right. Lady Eugenia Montague, a somewhat eccentric socialite with a fondness for lace gloves and lemongrass tea, had recently declared that her twin daughters would be hosting an afternoon party, not for their classmates or their cousins, but for their pet squirrels. The invitations, written in a careful copperplate script by Eugenia herself, read, "You are cordially invited to an afternoon of civility, cakes, and acorn cocktails in celebration of Sir Buttons, Miss Tuppence, and Admiral Netters." Now, the squirrels in question were, of course, not titled. But in Victorian England, where everyone seemed to be on a first-name basis with delusions of grandeur, no one blinked an eye. The girls were expected to lead their squirrel companions to the low tea table, help them perch politely on little wooden stools, and demonstrate proper feeding etiquette using tiny silver tongs. The purpose? To reinforce patience, humility, and the ever-crucial lesson of not speaking with your mouth full, even if one's mouth was full of nuts. But the event did not go as planned. Admiral Nutters, the rowdiest of the trio, had been feeling particularly energetic that day. The squirrel, dressed in a tiny velvet waistcoat, mind you, leaped from the armrest, grabbed a sugared scone in both paws, and dashed across the table, knocking over a dish of custard and sending Miss Tuppence into a flurry of screeches. The girls gasped. Lady Eugenia fainted. And Sir Buttons, in what some described as a show of loyalty, tackled Anne Murrell Netters near the fireplace. The two squirrels rolled, scrambled, and chatted in a high-speed blur of ruffled fur and fallen etiquette. What followed was a moment of quiet horror, and then laughter. The Montague girls learned, perhaps more deeply than any parlor book could teach, that no matter how finely dressed, nature still has its say. That day, amid overturned china and crumb-covered carpets, a new lesson took root. Sometimes, decorum must make room for wild joy. Later, in the parlor journal kept by the twins, one wrote, "We were told to guide the squirrels toward elegance, but in the end, they led us to laughter. Is that not its own form of manners?" And just like that, the squirrels' soiree became a minor legend among the Bath elite. Mothers wrote letters asking for tips. A neighbor even commissioned a portrait of the three rodents, in repose. But most notably, the Montague household quietly stopped pushing for perfection, and began valuing presents. And isn't it curious? That a creature known for darting, hoarding, and chasing its tail could teach a lesson in slowing down? That amid a culture obsessed with posture and polish, it was a squirrel in a waistcoat who reminded everyone to loosen their lace collars and laugh. We'll move now from Bath to Brighton, where another family and their squirrel companions, this time named Pepper, Pip, and Parsley, would take the idea of squirrel etiquette to even stranger heights. But before we scamper off into their story, take a moment. Inhale gently. Wiggle your toes under the blanket. Because it's in these soft, simple tales that the edges of history blur, and we find not facts, but feelings, nibbling gently at our memories. By now, you might already picture it in your dreams, the gentle rustle of satin skirts, the weight of a crinoline petticoat brushing against the hardwood floor, and a plump little squirrel nestled in a silver cage, twitching its nose as if it were pondering the meaning of decorum. In the drawing rooms of the more fashionable Victorian households, pet squirrels weren't just amusing companions, they were moral mirrors. If the child shouted, the squirrel fled. If the child moved with calm intention, the squirrel came closer. Victorian educators called this reflected discipline. It was believed that the behavior of the squirrel provided real-time feedback on a child's emotional control. Some etiquette manuals from the 1860s even encouraged upper-middle-class families to use squirrels as empathy instructors. The logic? Children would learn tenderness through the care of something easily startled, something whose affection had to be earned, not demanded. These books instructed. Never gesture near a squirrel too quickly. You must approach the creature as you would approach a superior, softly, with reverence. Parents, of course, loved this idea. It externalized discipline. It allowed them to say, "The squirrel is afraid of sudden movements," rather than, "You are too rough." The blame shifted gently from child to cause. Victorian discipline was often delivered with a layer of passive observation rather than confrontation. Some squirrel owners took this to peculiar heights. There are surviving letters from governesses detailing how children were made to whisper apologies to their squirrel as they were caught crying too loudly. One child even documented her weekly tea parties, where her squirrel, Mr. Thistle, sat on a miniature velvet cushion and judged the pinky-raising technique of guests. All of this sounds whimsical now, but in Victorian England, where appearances ruled and emotional repression was an art form, training your child through the lens of a squirrel was seen as elegant and progressive. There were, naturally, drawbacks. Squirrels are unpredictable. A few too many sugar cubes at tea time, and they'd leap straight into the center of the cake. One such incident at a birthday in Brighton led to a widely reported jam disaster, which prompted the Illustrated London News to publish a satirical cartoon titled, "The Squirrel's Revenge on Society." Still, the idea spread, if not always practiced with squirrels, then adapted with kittens, rabbits, and even songbirds. It was a behavioral template, animals as emotional barometers. Today, It's easy to chuckle at the idea of children learning manners from small woodland creatures. But perhaps there's wisdom in it, something about softness, slowness, attentiveness. A reminder that not all lessons need to be spoken. Some just need to be observed, tail flick by tail flick. And maybe, just maybe, the Victorians were onto something when they said, "He who learns to calm the squirrel, calms the self." Let's settle into the velvet cushioned drawing rooms of a modestly prosperous Victorian home. Afternoon sunlight filters through heavy drapes, falling across an embroidered footstool where one small desk perches. A red squirrel named Dash, wearing a miniature waistcoat stitched from leftover doll fabric. Dash is not just a pet. He is the moral barometer of the room. The children, seated in a half circle of embroidered chairs, are watching him carefully. Not just because he's cute, but because how they treat him will later be dissected by their governess. Did they speak too loudly when he approached? Did anyone grab? Did little Emily offer a nut with both hands and a gentle tone? In this genteel setting, animals were considered vessels of moral instruction. According to several etiquette manuals from the mid-1800s, pets were divine reflections of our own temperaments. If Dash runs away from you, perhaps you are too brusque. If he curls up in your lap, perhaps your heart is pure, or your pockets are full of hazelnuts. Parents, particularly mothers obsessed with domestic refinement, would stage entire squirrel teas. At these curious events, the children's ability to manage noise levels, posture, table manners, and gentle persuasion were all measured in the presence of a semi-wild animal. If the squirrel remained calm and engaged, the children received praise. If it fled or chatted angrily, there might be a somber debrief about unladylike shrieking or boorish elbows. Governesses recorded these observations in diaries, sometimes reporting to the parents with astonishing seriousness. Master Henry's tone has grown less urgent. Dash accepted 2 pine nuts with no visible distress. This wasn't just about politeness. It was a broader philosophy of harmony with nature. Victorian households believed strongly in the didactic power of nature, especially for young minds. Books with titles like Animal Friends and What They Teach Us in Manners from the meadow-filled nursery shelves. In them, children were encouraged to emulate the loyalty of dogs, the grace of cats, and surprisingly often, the poise of squirrels. Why squirrels? They were seen as alert, discerning creatures, quick but not reckless, curious but cautious. The perfect foil for overexcitable children prone to tantrums or sugar rushes. Teaching a child to win a squirrel's trust, to feed it gently and be still while it climbed their arm, was seen as far more effective than 100 scoldings about interrupting dinner conversation. And here lies the true charm of this curious practice. It wasn't entirely wrong. Even today, we recognize the emotional intelligence required to bond with an animal. It's just that the Victorians, in their ruffled skirts and high collars, leaned into it with theatrical devotion. What we see as eccentric, they treated as spiritual education. Of course, there were occasional mishaps. The memoirs of one household in Hampshire mention a young guest who accidentally sat on the squirrel and caused a weeks-long scandal, complete with tearful apologies and a squirrel-sized memorial service involving rose petals and plum cake. But mostly, the rodents survived. And the children, well, they emerged a little calmer, a little gentler, and slightly more aware of their own shrill tendencies. It's a portrait of a time when even the living room was a classroom, and every gesture, toward people or pets, was a lesson in grace. So the next time you see a squirrel darting across a park path, imagine him as a tiny etiquette tutor, silently judging your posture and composure. Let us return to that quaint little drawing room, where lace curtains rustled against open windows, and the scent of lemon polish lingered on every side table. Afternoon visits were a central fixture of polite society in Victorian England, not just for adults, but increasingly for children. It was in these miniature social calls that young ones rehearsed their budding etiquette, often under the careful supervision of, you guessed it, pet squirrels. You see, by this point in the century, the squirrel was no longer just a curiosity housed in a cage in the corner of the nursery. It had, somehow, become a mirror for human decorum. A mother would say to her child, "Watch how Chestnut nibbles, no crumbs at all." That's how a guest should behave. And indeed, the child would sit up straighter, raise their teacup with both hands, and mindfully copy their bushy-tailed tutor. The squirrel, for its part, was not just a passive observer. Trainers, often family governesses or hired tutors, had developed clever ways of incorporating these animals into the actual social rituals. A favorite game involved placing tiny objects, a thimble, a sugar cube, or a ribbon, at one end of the parlor and asking the child to guide the squirrel to fetch the correct item, all while maintaining a poised tone and using proper language. "Would you be so kind, Miss Chestnut, as to bring me the sugar?" the child might ask. And if the squirrel obeyed, or at least made a show of trotting over, the room would erupt in polite applause. Of course, not all squirrels were equally inclined towards such pageantry. Some, perhaps fed up with the demands of the parlor stage, would retreat into curtains, overturn teacups, or commit the cardinal sin of nibbling a crumpet uninvited. These incidents, far from being disruptive, served as valuable teaching moments. "See how Mr. Suppard didn't wait his turn? That's what we must avoid at Mrs. Penelope's next gathering." The squirrel, like a living metaphor, helped children understand boundaries, both physical and social. At the heart of this strange tradition was the Victorian obsession with discipline wrapped in charm. To teach without scolding, to correct without harshness. A squirrel's unpredictable nature kept children alert, not through fear, but through fascination. They learned to speak softly, to observe body language, to anticipate movement, all traits that, strangely enough, also served them well in adult courtships and business negotiations later in life. Some households even formalized the role of their pet squirrel. A few diaries reference creatures with titles like Sir Acorn or Madam Nutley, complete with tiny waistcoats sewn by hand. During garden parties, children would introduce their squirrels to guests with solemn pride, as if they were presenting a foreign ambassador. And in return, guests were expected to offer compliments. "What a dashing creature you have, Miss Beatrice. Does he always perch so elegantly?" Behind all this, of course, lay the larger Victorian need to mold childhood into something tidy and noble. The presence of an animal, something natural, unpredictable, even wild, gave the illusion of softness to what was, in fact, a strict and methodical social machine. The squirrel was both mask and mirror, concealing the rigid machinery behind manners while reflecting it in miniature, nut-sized performances. As you drift further into this hazy world of lace, lemon biscuits, and tooted squirrels, ask yourself, how different would your own childhood have been if you'd learned patience and politeness by negotiating tea time with a well-dressed rodent? Imagine a child no taller than the mantel clock in his uncle's shop, carefully winding gears while a gray squirrel perched beside him nibbled on a pine net, its tiny paws barely making a sound on the polished brass. This wasn't a dream, not in 1870s Bath. This was Tuesday. In this chapter, we drift gently into the curious home life of clockmakers and inventors in Victorian England, where precision wasn't just for cogs and springs, it extended to child rearing as well, particularly among a rare breed of artisans who believed that time, like good manners, must be measured in quiet, repetitive gestures. The boy's name was Elgin. His uncle, Master Bransby, kept 12 clocks running at all times in the house, each precisely set 5 minutes apart, not because he was eccentric, but because he believed life should always be approaching punctuality, never grasping it directly. And there among the ticking silence, Elgin's best friend was Porridge, a red squirrel who had, for reasons unknown to anyone, taken to polishing clock hands with his nose. Bransby wasn't just training Elgin in horology. No, he was teaching him patience, posture, restraint. You cannot yank a pendulum into stillness. You must wait, observe, and breathe. The squirrel, it seemed, became the physical embodiment of this philosophy. When Elgin fed him, it was with 2 hands and bowed head. When Porridge curled up beside the fireplace, Elgin was expected to keep silent as a cathedral mouse. And thus began the great tradition of pine nut parlors, informal gatherings where children would rehearse polite gestures under the vigilant gaze of their rodent companions. Small bowls of nuts were set on doilies, and children took turns bowing to the squirrel, offering it one, and retreating 3 steps without turning their backs. This was etiquette not as punishment, but as performance. We might think this sounds absurd, but in the quiet hearts of these homes, where the tick-tock of legacy was passed from uncle to nephew, girl to younger cousin, it made sense. After all, a squirrel demands no titles, no inheritance, only consistency. And isn't that what true manners are deep down? A promise of steady, predictable gentleness? In some parts of Liverpool, there were even squirrel choirs. Children would hum at the same tone until the squirrels stopped eating, thus training their volume and tone modulation. Victorian music teachers took note. They began using squirrels as warm-up judges. It was said that if a squirrel didn't blink during your aria, your vibrato was acceptable. These tales weren't written down. They were whispered over teacups, etched into family lore, and passed on like good silverware. And through it all, the squirrel became a symbol, not just of nature's whimsy, but of nature's patience. Something Victorian children, growing under lace-curtain roofs and endless expectations, desperately needed. So tonight, as the clocks tick in your own home, or hum gently through your phone, think of Elgin and porridge. Of the pine nut parlors. Of lessons not shouted, but whispered between paw and hand. And if you've ever felt out of place for needing quiet, for preferring peace, for befriending the small and odd, maybe you, too, would have done well in a house of 12 clocks and one very polite squirrel. Now let's follow that ticking sound into the next chapter, where we meet a governess who trained children to curtsy based on a squirrel's tail swish. Tonight, let's gently unseal a bundle of parchment letters, edges curled with time, ink faded but not forgotten, written not from parent to child, nor teacher to pupil, but from child to squirrel. Yes, in the later half of the 19th century, when the notion of emotional intelligence was budding within certain corners of the Victorian elite, a new parenting method emerged in some genteel households. Children, already tasked with grooming, feeding, and conversing with their pet squirrels, were now encouraged to go one step further, write them letters. At first glance, this might seem like the charming whimsy of a lonely governess or an overzealous etiquette manual. But beneath it lay a deeper purpose. These letters weren't truly meant for the squirrels, although some children believed they were. They were, in fact, a gentle exercise in self-regulation, storytelling, and self-reflection. Imagine a 10-year-old named Eleanor, perched at her writing desk beneath a doily-trimmed window, scribbling. Dearest Nuckin, today I became quite cross with Mary for taking my lavender ribbon, but I remembered your patience when the cat chased you last Tuesday. I took a breath and said nothing cruel. I hope you are proud. Yours always, Ellie. Writing to an animal who could not respond gave children space to be honest without fear of reprimand. It encouraged them to externalize their emotions, much like a diary, but with a sense of warmth and responsibility that even the blank page could not offer. Parents would sometimes read these letters, quietly, discreetly, gleaning insight into their child's inner world without having to pry. Squirrels, being small, clever, and silent, were the perfect confidants. They weren't boisterous like dogs or aloof like cats. They simply listened. Or so it was believed. They made no judgments. No interruptions. They blinked their little black eyes and nibbled politely on a nut while Victorian children poured out their hopes, regrets, and daily dramas. Some schools adopted the technique in moral instruction classes, particularly among girls. Write to your squirrel about what you did well this week, one guidebook instructed. And if you stumbled, tell him that too. He forgives you. Of course, not all children took it so seriously. Some letters are delightfully absurd. Naughty, I stole a biscuit, but only because you look hungry and mother said no. I regret nothing. By the late 1880s, the trend waned as new psychological theories emerged and parenting shifted toward more structured, clinical approaches. But in a few rare collections, usually preserved in family archives or quaint village museums, these letters survive, snippets of a forgotten kindness. A practice so odd, and yet so intimate. A mirror of emotional growth, disguised as make-believe. Perhaps this is what the Victorians did best. Conceal the most important lessons behind velvet curtains of whimsy. And as you rest tonight, imagine writing your own letter, not to a squirrel, perhaps, but to the part of you that longs to be heard without interruption. What would you say? As the ink dries on Eleanor's final word and the lamplight fades from her bedroom window, we move now to another strange chapter in this curious tale of manners and mammals. In the drawing room of any well-raised Victorian child, there were rules about interruptions. The sort of rules you didn't shout, but rather whispered gently, the way wind glides through lace curtains on a spring morning. Let's imagine this. You are 10 years old. You've just been invited to a tea party. Not a pretend one. A real one. There are scones, real ones this time, and cucumber sandwiches with the crusts clipped off like tiny hedges. Your mother has polished your boots, and your gloves have been dabbed with lavender water. You've brought a gift for the hostess, a small embroidered handkerchief, folded perfectly into a box lined with newspaper. And just when you're about to tell everyone your story about the squirrel who stole your bonnet, you are gently silenced. Not rudely. Not at all. But with the careful raising of an eyebrow from Miss Priscilla, age 11, aspiring headmistress, who reminds you, ever so kindly, that Clara is still speaking. You learn in that moment what every Victorian child was taught, and often modeled by watching not other children, but animals, the virtue of waiting your turn. Now, what do squirrels have to do with this? Everything. Because in many refined households, squirrels were not just novelty pets. They were living, rustling metaphors. Observing them during feeding time was a training ground for patience. Squirrels took turns somewhat. They waited for pine nuts. They nuzzled fingers only after sniffing permission. And while they occasionally squabbled, a well-fed pet squirrel usually didn't barge in like a spoiled pug. A child was expected to mimic this gentle order. Sometimes the squirrels were even used as a silent cue. A mother, unwilling to interrupt the flow of conversation, might look pointedly at the squirrel in its little cage, sitting calmly, tail curled, and her child would get the message, sit still, be quiet, your time will come. It's hard to imagine now, isn't it? That a society so rigid could find behavioral inspiration in such a fidgety little creature. But the Victorians didn't see contradictions. They saw lessons. They believed waiting, like breathing, should be practiced. And so it was. From the squirrel cage to the tea table, etiquette marched forward. In some elite schools, children were asked to practice invisible waiting. That meant you could not tap your fingers, shuffle your boots, or frown. You waited your turn like the squirrel waited for the next nut, ears alert, posture pleasant, eyes soft. And if you failed? No harsh words. Just a mark in the manners journal. Perhaps a pine cone placed in your lunchbox as a reminder. Next time, wait. It's charming. And a little absurd. But these rituals train not only patience but poise. Because in the Victorian world, how you waited often said more about you than what you said when your turn arrived. Tonight, we find ourselves standing on the front lawn of a prim Victorian country house, where a curious event is about to take place. The year is 1879, and it's the annual etiquette exhibition and demonstration, informally dubbed by the local papers as the Etiquette Olympics. You see, in certain upper-class British households, especially those desperate to out-Victorian each other, teaching children good manners wasn't just a duty, it was a sport, a performance, a badge of honor. And at the center of today's pageantry? Pet squirrels, once again. Yes, squirrels. The children, all dressed in starched white outfits that dared not show a single wrinkle or stray thread, had been practicing for weeks. They were to demonstrate the full range of their genteel training, from graceful bows to the flawless placement of dessert spoons. But the real spectacle, the part the neighbors came to witness while sipping weak lemon water in the shade of lace umbrellas, was the squirrel service relay. Each child would guide their pet squirrel, outfitted in a tiny waistcoat or bonnet, through a series of tasks, fetching a handkerchief, delivering a thank you card, even demonstrating a polite refusal of an extra biscuit. The crowd would ooh and ah, as each child knelt gracefully and whispered a command in their softest tone. Mr. Chestnut, if you please. The judges, 3 elderly ladies with lorgnettes and at least 2 titles between them, scored on posture, diction, coordination, and most importantly, the manners of the squirrel. One child was penalized when their squirrel, in a tragic breach of protocol, chewed on a calling card instead of delivering it. Gasps were heard. Someone fainted. This may all sound exaggerated, but Victorian Britain had a unique ability to turn childhood into ceremonial theatre. Sunday schools gave prizes for most upright child. Families hired elocution tutors who corrected not just accent but breath control. And pet squirrels? They were sometimes included as tools in lessons because of their high-maintenance nature, requiring gentleness, attentiveness, and a certain unshakable calm that reflected well on the child's upbringing. In the journals of Miss Gwendolyn R. Featherstone, a 13-year-old etiquette champion of her village in Norfolk, we find entries like, Mr. Acorn successfully retrieved the rose-scented glove from Cousin Hattie's sill. I curtsied to thunderous applause. Father was visibly moved. Gwendolyn Squirrel had a bow tie made of hand-stitched lace and a reputation for being better behaved than the local vicar's terrier. Yet beyond the performances and the awards, this obsession with etiquette came with pressure. Children were expected to exhibit adult-level decorum before they could spell decorum. Spontaneity was frowned upon. Laughter had to be practiced in front of mirrors. Applause had to be polite, dainty, and ideally inaudible. Imagine growing up in a world where excessive enthusiasm might land you in a chair with a book balanced on your head until dinner. But there was a strange comfort in the rules. In a society plagued by uncertainty, revolutions abroad, industrial upheaval at home, these rituals offered structure. A set of codes that told you how to belong. Even the squirrels, in their own fluffy way, had to follow these codes. They were gently trained to sit still during tea, to accept sugar cubes without grabbing, and in rare cases, to turn their backs to people who hadn't said, please. The squirrels weren't just cute props. They were, oddly, reflections of a family's moral discipline. So tonight, as we leave behind the primrose garden and the rustle of petticoats, we carry with us the image of a tiny squirrel in a cravat, balancing on a teacup, surrounded by children determined to perfect the art of gentility. And just as the judges marked the final scores on ivory cards, we too, quietly, turn the page to what comes next in this rather nutty chapter of Victorian decorum. By now, we've seen how the upper crust of Victorian society shaped their children's world with every imaginable tool, from silver spoons to squirrel leashes. But here, in the quieter drawing rooms and soft morning parlors, another strange trend began to flourish: the squirrel as a behavioral barometer. Yes, believe it or not, young children were sometimes judged not just by their table manners or posture, but by how well they treated their squirrels. One widely shared story, printed in a children's magazine in 1874, told the tale of a little boy named Reggie who refused to share his walnut with Sir Chestnut, his pet squirrel. The next day, Sir Chestnut ignored him, an offense that led Reggie's governess to declare that even wrote its recall from selfishness. A moral lesson, yes, but also a parable crafted to shape young minds through their affection for their animals. This was the era of didactic pets, after all. Squirrels became reflections of a child's soul. If a squirrel seemed jittery or unhappy, it was sometimes seen as a sign of unresolved inner misbehavior. And if a squirrel nestled calmly into the child's lap during visitors' tea hour, that was taken as evidence of emotional maturity and restraint. Some journals even listed squirrel temperament charts, tables meant to help caregivers assess both pet and child side by side. For example, squirrel easily startled? The child may be prone to fibbing. Squirrel hides food and shoes? Child likely hoards toys or sweets. Squirrel climbs too high indoors. Child has trouble following limits. Today, this may seem like playful pseudopsychology, but in Victorian England, it was taken quite seriously, especially by nannies hoping to impress with their thoroughness. Even more curiously, Queen Victoria's own diaries reference a young guest who brought her squirrel into Buckingham Palace. The animal ran across a visiting diplomat's lap during a reception. According to court gossip, the Queen was more amused than annoyed, noting that the boy has discipline, for the beast was coaxed back with no fuss at all. The notion of pet etiquette extended even to squirrel diets. Children were expected to carefully peel chestnuts, soak hazelnuts, and never, under any circumstance, offer stale breadcrumbs. A gentleman never serves what he would not eat, was the rule, applied equally to guests and to bushy-tailed companions. This anthropomorphism, charming or absurd depending on your view, reached peak popularity during the 1880s. Entire etiquette books emerged devoted to the mannered child and his animal. These included sections like polite introductions, when and how to present your squirrel, dress codes and leash protocols for afternoon strolls, consoling your pet after a public faux pas. These books, printed in delicate fonts and bound in soft leather, were sometimes given as birthday gifts to girls and boys of a certain class. And some of them have survived, tucked into dusty archives, annotated by tiny hands learning to be proper through play. What all of this tells us is not just that Victorians were eccentric, but that they saw in animals an opportunity to teach values without scolding. A child might resent a harsh word from an adult, but a judgmental look from a squirrel, that was something else entirely. It bypassed the defensive mind and went straight to the heart. So next time you see a squirrel on a park bench or scurrying up a tree, think of those little boys and girls learning patience, generosity, and restraint, not from sermons, but from whiskers and twitchy tails. And from here, our tale tiptoes towards something even more peculiar. Because if a squirrel could teach manners, what else could it learn to do? By the late 1800s, as squirrels became even more common in parlor windows and drawing room cages, a curious thing happened. The squirrels began pushing back. No, not with teeth or claws, though that certainly happened from time to time, but in far more subtle and inconvenient ways. They chewed through lace curtains. They stole ink pens from writing desks. They escaped their cages with uncanny ease and left little calling cards in grandmother's embroidery basket. One memoir from a nanny in Bath recorded how a particularly clever squirrel named Crumpet had learned to unlatch his cage, retrieve a sugar cube from the tea tray, and sneak it back to his little corner, without being noticed until the entire tray had been plundered. Crumpet's antics were a revelation. Children no longer saw the squirrels as passive props for etiquette drills. They now watched them as co-conspirators, as tiny rebels thumbing their twitching noses at adult expectations. In London, a certain Lord Windermere's great-granddaughter recounted in her journals how their squirrel, Lord Chestnut, would routinely escape to hide inside piano harps, only to jump out mid-song during her lessons with Miss Penelope. The result, terrified shrieks, ruined arpeggios, and eventually, the termination of poor Miss Penelope's employment. Some of the more mischievous children took inspiration. If squirrels didn't want to bow on command or sit still in waistcoats, why should they? Etiquette manuals had to adapt. One revised edition of Virtue and Youth included a new chapter, The Proper Discipline and Encouragement of Domesticated Tree Dwellers. It suggested gentle corrections, ample treats, and above all, patience, a virtue often lost in high society, but urgently needed when dealing with rodents. In a broader sense, the squirrel uprising revealed something else, the limits of Victorian control. For all their roles and routines, not everything could be tamed. Nature had a funny way of reminding its masters who was truly in charge, even if the reminder came with fur, acorns, and a talent for mischief. This period, sometimes jokingly referred to as the Great Squirrel Question, prompted drawing room debates over whether children should be allowed to keep such troublesome creatures. Some families traded squirrels for songbirds or rabbits. Others doubled down, building elaborate squirrel playhouses with glass tunnels and tiny leashes. But by then, the idea of a perfectly behaved pet had already begun to crumble. And with it, the image of the perfectly behaved child. Even more surprising, some parents began to admire the squirrel's unruly independence. "At least the squirrel knows what it wants," wrote one father in the Gentleman's Quarterly. "My son still can't decide whether he prefers mutton or veal." In a world obsessed with manners and control, the little animals brought in to teach discipline had, somehow, taught freedom instead. Let's pause here. Imagine it, a Victorian sitting room, a boy in velvet knickers practicing a bow, and behind him, a squirrel quietly chewing through the family's copy of Pilgrim's Progress. Now let us turn the tables, just for a moment, and see the world from the eyes of the real heroes in our tale, the pet squirrels themselves. If, in some dusty parlor of 1860s Bath or a window-box nursery in Edinburgh, a little red squirrel had kept a diary, what might it say? Day 48, the small human placed a ribbon around my tail again. She called it charming. I find it obstructive. This whimsical shift in perspective might seem like an indulgence, but it actually speaks volumes about the imaginative relationship Victorians had with animals, especially the elite and the gently mad. While modern society tends to anthropomorphize pets to cartoons or Instagram captions, the Victorians documented these inner squirrel monologues in full watercolor diaries, copperplate journals, and elaborate lithographs. These were not mere pets. These were companions, confidants, and symbols of childlike virtue. In one well-preserved folio from the Cambridgeshire countryside, a governess wrote daily letters from the family squirrel. Percival, addressed to the youngest child. She would read them aloud after supper. Dearest Miss Georgina, today I declined the hazelnuts. Too oily, I fear. Instead, I watched the butler chase shadows on the wall. Percival, of course, served a role. His literary voice gently corrected the child's behavior, praising Georgina for not interrupting her older brother, or noting that I, too, resist the temptation to scratch when nurse is lecturing. In essence, he became a furry extension of Victorian morality, dressed in whimsy. And it wasn't just the children who took these rodent reflections seriously. The parents, often aloof during the day, would listen during tea with raised brows and concealed smiles, subtly reaffirming the lessons taught. Moral reinforcement, it seemed, went down easier when served with a velvet paw and a twitchy tail. Historians now believe that these squirrel diaries helped birth early forms of children's fiction, stories that centered around small creatures with large ethical frameworks. Beatrix Potter's later tales owe a hidden deck to these prim little mammals whose lives were narrated by governesses across Britain's stately homes. Indeed, by filtering human behavior through the imagined ethics of a squirrel, the Victorians managed to soothe both children and themselves. The squirrel was the ideal narrator, observant but silent, spirited but tame, and always, a proper gentleman in his conduct. Which brings us to an unexpected discovery in an attic in Sussex, an entire series of squirrel stories bound in pressed leather, label S. Truffleton's Memoirs, Volume 1 to 6. Within the pages, parlor room etiquette, garden escapades, and an unrequited love for the neighbor's hedgehog. Yes, truly. As you drift off tonight, perhaps imagine yourself in a rocking chair by the fire, turning pages in one of those squirrel memoirs, reading about the day S. Truffleton refused to gnaw on the rosewood table leg, even though everyone else was doing it. Not because he couldn't, but because it was dreadfully rude. As the 19th century wore on, a curious new fixture began appearing in village greens and fairgrounds across England, traveling menageries. These mobile zoos, often owned by eccentric showmen or amateur naturalists, would pitch tents and showcase exotic animals to the wide-eyed public. Lions, camels, monkeys, and yes, the occasional trained squirrel. Now you might wonder, what did a well-behaved Victorian child learn from watching a squirrel juggle nuts or ride a miniature bicycle? More than you'd expect. These exhibitions were not just about novelty. They were about etiquette, posture, and public behavior. Children were expected to observe quietly, ask polite questions, and above all, demonstrate restraint. No running. No shrieking. No poking at the ferrets. In this way, traveling menageries served as informal schools of social grace. Mothers would whisper in their child's ear, "See how that squirrel sits so still before the bell? That's called patience." A virtue, indeed, drilled into the marrow of Victorian society. Some showmen went further, giving their squirrels names like Count Dignity or Lady Civility, and narrating entire pantomimes around their adventures. One popular act involved the squirrel ambassador arriving in a model carriage, unfurling a scroll, and bowing before a queenly raccoon, an elaborate allegory of diplomatic etiquette, played out on a stage of straw and wood chips. In private homes, these performances echoed subtly through playtime. Children who saw the traveling squirrel would go home and stage their own courtly scenes with stuffed animals. One girl reportedly taught her squirrel to ring a bell for supper and to bow his head before accepting a peanut, a dinner ritual she mimicked with her dolls. And yes, the menageries had their critics. The Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals occasionally issued warnings about overworked animals or poor cage conditions. But for the average Victorian child, the squirrel with the ruffled collar was less a victim than a teacher. He was a tiny moral tutor, balancing on a barrel, reminding you to say, "Thank you," and not chew with your mouth open. Of course, not every family could afford to attend these shows. Some learned of them secondhand through illustrations or stories passed around the nursery. A child might fall asleep listening to tales of a squirrel diplomat who negotiated peace between warring hamster tribes. A bedtime story wrapped in a parable of civility and restraint. And so, our tale continues. Let's drift now into a most peculiar yet delightfully detailed chapter in the manners playbook of elite Victorian children, a realm not written in the pages of etiquette manuals, but acted out in secret little societies known as squirrel courts. These weren't official courts, of course. They were whimsical, childlike parodies of adult behavior. Hosted in the nursery or behind the hedgerow, these courts featured children dressed in sashes, paper wigs, or capes made from the parlor curtains. The accused? Usually a sibling or playmate, and on rarer, more dramatic occasions, the squirrel itself. Charges ranged from high crimes like spilling raspberry jam without permission, to minor infractions like forgetting to bow to Lady Nuckin. Yes, that was often the squirrel's name, Lady Nuckin, or Lord Fluffwhistle. There was no limit to the absurd grandeur. What's most telling is that these play courts weren't just amusement. They trained children in a sort of performative civility. You learn how to stand tall when falsely accused. You learn to bow your head in apology. You learned, above all, that honor, even squirrel honor, must be defended with quiet dignity. Children learn to negotiate, to arbitrate, and even to forgive in front of their peers. The courtroom became a stage for cultivating restraint. No tantrums, no shouting. A measured eye object was the preferred response, followed by a dainty sip of lemon water and a stare into the middle distance, just like the grown-ups did. Sometimes the squirrel was given a tiny scroll, a pretend pardon, or sentence. One girl in Bath wrote that her squirrel, Sir Chesterton, was once sentenced to 20 minutes of tail fluffing for scratching her lace gloves, and she dutifully carried up the punishment with a small soft brush while he napped in her lap, entirely oblivious to the crime. The idea was never to punish, really. It was about ceremony, drama, and the slow, comforting rhythm of justice carried out politely. And when the trial ended, the children would bow to the squirrel and invite it to the afternoon feast, which usually consisted of biscuits, elderflower cordial, and crumbs arranged in a spiral. These rituals may sound odd, but they were formative. In a world where adult behavior was rigid and layered with unspoken codes, the nursery court gave children a way to process those rules. They mimicked what they saw, and softened it with imagination. Now pause and imagine a sunlit room, floral curtains swaying, and a squirrel perched on a windowsill. Around him, a summer circle of serious little judges in wool stockings and satin sashes, all debating whether he has eaten too many almonds or not enough. Was it ridiculous? Entirely. But was it deeply human? Absolutely. Because even in play, Victorian children were learning how to hold space for grace, for dignity, and for one another's small missteps. And isn't that what manners are all about? Let us now drift gently into the story of a very particular companion, a creature so small and sprightly, and yet so deeply revered that it earned a seat at the table, quite literally. In the Victorian nursery, not every squirrel was simply a pet. Some were appointed as instructors, models, or even behavioral mirrors, meant to reflect the manners expected of their tiny human companions. In this part of our quiet journey, we meet Lady Penelope Fairfax, a baron's only daughter with hair like polished copper and a will as stubborn as Emile's. At age 6, Penelope had already terrified 3 governesses and refused to curtsy at any tea. Her mother, however, desperate not to have the child grow up into a scandalous adult who might, heaven forbid, speak before being spoken to, introduced a peculiar tutor, a gray squirrel named Pickle. Now Pickle was no ordinary rodent. He wore a velvet collar stitched with golden thread. He was trained, reportedly by a retired circus performer, to lift his tiny paw before taking food, to sit up straight on command, and to scurry away when a voice was raised, something he did often, given Penelope's temperament. Lady Fairfax sat her daughter down. "Pickle," she said, "is the very model of restraint. You shall learn from him, or I shall remove all the marzipan from the pantry." From that day forward, Penelope was made to observe Pickle each morning as he demonstrated the three graces: waiting, watching, and whisker cleaning. The idea was simple. If a rodent could practice restraint before nibbling, surely a young noblewoman could manage to wait her turn before speaking. And while it might sound utterly ridiculous now, this was common in upper-class households of the era. Squirrels became metaphors, living props in a moral theater of refinement. Children were told, "Don't slouch like a toad, sit upright like Squire Squirrel." The animals were not pets in the usual sense, but living mirrors for the behavior adults wished to see. Eventually, Pickle's fame spread. Penelope not only learned to curtsy, but also began to teach her younger cousins how to properly hold a teacup using Pickle's postures as a guide. She even insisted he be present at her 7th birthday celebration, where he sat at the head of the table nibbling a sugared almond with such poise that 2 ants fainted from joy. Was Pickle truly a symbol of Victorian discipline, or just a well-fed distraction from human folly? That depends on how you view history, through logic or through lace curtains. But one thing's for sure, in a world of strict rules and fussy fashion, even a squirrel could become a spiritual guide. And so we close today's chapter with the soft rustle of a little tail, brushing against etiquette manuals, and the quiet giggle of a child trying very hard not to spill her tea. Let's leave behind the bustling city of London and step gently into the leafy calm of Finchley, a peaceful suburb where upper-middle-class families of the 1880s would often retreat from the grime and clamor of industrial life. It is here that one of the most curiously genteel clubs of the era began, an informal circle known among the neighborhood's governesses and housemaids as the Squirrel Sitting Society. No, it wasn't a formalized institution with membership cards or engraved silver teapots. Rather, it was a rotating group of caretakers and curious children who took turns minding each other's pet squirrels when one family was called away to Bath, Brighton, or some distant cousin's estate in Yorkshire. But to those involved, the duties were taken just as seriously as if they were protecting state secrets. On any quiet Thursday afternoon, you might have found little Annabel Winsworth, age 7 and known for her petticoats always being slightly askew, seated cross-legged in the drawing room of the Perkins residence. In her lap, nestled comfortably, was a plump gray squirrel named Lieutenant Nibs, named after a naval officer the family greatly admired but who, unlike the rodent, could not perform backflips for walnuts. Annabel's task was to ensure the squirrel received his customary 4 o'clock nut, followed by a supervised frolic under the piano. She carried this out with the solemnity most children today reserve for scrolling through endless tablet games. Meanwhile, upstairs in the nursery, Miss Harriet Perkins, the squirrel's temporary guardian, was polishing a tiny silver bowl for Nibs's water, muttering to herself about the unacceptable smudges left by her brother's careless handling. This society of squirrel sitters may sound utterly quaint now, but in its time, it was viewed as a mark of exceptional responsibility. The ability to care for another family's pet, even one as lively and unpredictable as a trained squirrel, was noted in household diaries and even brought up during dinner parties. One matron wrote in her weekly letter to her sister in Derbyshire, "Young Arthur has at last completed his fortnight of squirrel sitting without incident. He is now permitted to sit at the grown-up table for Sunday pudding." The skills gained were practical too. Children learned routine, observation, and calm handling. More importantly, they learned to internalize the importance of predictability. Squirrels, after all, dislike sudden noises and surprise changes just as much as visiting dignitaries. Mothers claimed that after 2 weeks with the squirrel, even the rowdiest child would start folding handkerchiefs voluntarily and saying, "Please," and "Thank you," to the housemaid without prompting. It was like magic. Fuzzy, not crunching, whisker twitching magic. And of course, each child who participated was allowed to keep a single squirrel whisker, collected during natural shedding, as a souvenir. These were sometimes placed in lockets, other times slipped between the pages of etiquette primers, as if to remind the child that grace, like squirrel handling, required delicacy, patience, and a well-timed snack. As the late afternoon sun dipped low over Finchley and lanterns began to glow inside lace-curtained windows, another day of careful, respectful squirrel raising came to a close. In the soft rustle of leaves and the distant chime of a carriage bell, perhaps you can still hear the quiet pride of a small hand gently stroking a squirrel's back, whispering, "You've done very well today, Lieutenant Nibs." Picture this: a sunny afternoon in 1872, a rose garden in full bloom, and a young girl in ruffled cotton with a red velvet leash in her hand. But at the end of that leash, not a poodle, not even a cat. It's a well-combed squirrel named Archibald, trotting along in a tiny silver button vest. In this part of our unusually polite story, we arrive at the Victorian Pet Parade, an unspoken weekly tradition among upper-middle-class families that combine pageantry, etiquette, and squirrels. These parades weren't formal events with banners and music. No, they were more like subtly competitive strolls through the neighborhood. Each child brought their pet, often a tame squirrel, hedgehog, or even a parrot, out for a walk. Parents watched from porches with teacups, judging quietly. But this wasn't just about cuteness. The real point was to show the animal's obedience and the child's gentle handling. You see, in Victorian philosophy, how you treated your pet was believed to mirror your ability to treat servants and someday, a spouse. If you tugged a leash, shouted commands, or let your pet misbehave, you were seen as unfit for society. So a child whose squirrel sat still when told or fetched a miniature handkerchief on cue, that was a child going places. Some of these squirrels had their own embroidered calling cards. Others wore silk boots to keep their claws from scratching parquet floors. It was also much more than animal training. It was an early crash course in charm, grace, and self-restraint. Parents often whispered to one another during these walks, "Did you see how young Clara's squirrel bowed its head to the baker's wife? Such refinement. Harold's rodent bit his glove, you know. Bit it. That will reflect poorly on the boy's lad and tutor, surely." In one recorded case from a diary in Sussex, a boy was disinvited from summer tea lessons because his squirrel made a mess of a rose bush. The squirrel was in the bush, and the boy in disgrace. The diary entry read. And yes, squirrels had to be dressed accordingly. No barefoot embarrassment. Common attire included velvet doublets, lace-trimmed collars, and even monogrammed slippers, designed for tails, of course. The spectacle was never announced in the town square, but everyone knew. If it was Saturday at 3 p.m. and the weather was fair, you had better be on the promenade with your squirrel dressed to impress. It was a slow-moving, rustling procession of tutored rodents and terrified children, all trying to remember the correct hand signals and posture. Some families went as far as hiring retired governesses to train the squirrels in etiquette. Can you imagine? A grown woman bowing to a rodent and offering it a raisin in exchange for a well-executed pirouette? This was the logic of the time. If a squirrel can sit through afternoon tea without scratching anyone or stealing sugar cubes, then your child had truly mastered themselves. Let's take a moment to breathe that in: velvet waistcoats, sugar cubes, and leash politeness in an age before cartoons or screen time. It was absurd, and it was elegant. It was the Victorian way. And as you close your eyes tonight, perhaps you'll picture your own version of this: a soft-spoken parade, squirrels in tiny hats, and a world where manners meant everything, even to your pet. In a quiet London suburb in 1873, a young boy named Frederick was gifted something peculiar for his 9th birthday. It wasn't a new waistcoat or a book of fairy tales. He already had plenty of those. No, what Frederick unwrapped, beneath layers of linen and ribbon, was a mechanical mouse made of brass, tin gears, and a velvet tail. It whirred to life when wound up, darting across the carpet in polite little zigzags. But this wasn't just a toy. In true Victorian fashion, it was a lesson in disguise. You see, the clockwork mouse, was part of a rising household educational philosophy, mechanized morality. Wealthy families had begun integrating automata, those marvelous wind-up creatures, into their parlor lessons. Children were taught to observe how even a mechanical mouse followed predictable, graceful patterns. It never bumped into furniture or charged ahead recklessly. A proper gentleman, Frederick's governess would remark, ought to walk just so. Frederick's pet squirrel, named Peppernut, was both fascinated and infuriated by this shiny interloper. The governess took this rivalry as an opportunity. She began hosting daily squirrel tea parties. On one side of the miniature tea table sat Peppernut, perched with comical seriousness, occasionally pawing at the teacup. Opposite him, the brass mouse whirred its way into a seated position, assisted by a discreet string. The point? To illustrate social etiquette through mimicry and contrast. Peppernut, the living creature, was wild but trainable. The mouse, the artificial peer, was controlled but utterly predictable. The lesson taught to children like Frederick: real behavior must combine both obedience and spontaneity, grace and spirit. This absurd pageant, squirrels, tea sets, and tin mice, was just one of countless Victorian methods to blur the lines between play and social programming. Mothers, governesses, and even neighborhood clergymen were increasingly obsessed with the performance of virtue. It wasn't enough to be polite. One had to be charmingly, delightfully so, even if it meant practicing bows with squirrels and winding up a toy to teach dignity. And in case you're wondering, yes, Peppernut once flipped the table. He leapt onto the clockwork mouse and sent it crashing to the floor. Frederick cried, the governess fainted, and a new lesson was born. True manners are tested not in calm, but in chaos. While many Victorians were satisfied with teaching their children to balance peas on the back of a fork or cut a roast with proper wrist alignment, some households, wealthy, eccentric, or just overly optimistic, took things a bit further. Their secret weapon? The table manners of a pet squirrel. Picture a squirrel in a tiny lace bed, seated on a side perch at the family dinner table, paws primly folded. Well, as primly as paws can fold. These creatures weren't merely for show, they were performers in a daily pantomime of polite behavior. Trained to refuse seconds with a dignified turn of the head, or to wait their turn for dessert by clutching their tail solemnly, these rodents became tools of socialization in homes that prioritized elegance down to the final crumb. For the child who refused to say, "Please," a mother might gently point to the squirrel. "Look at Chestnut," she'd say. "He always waits to be offered." The unspoken lesson: if a squirrel can manage it, so can you. Victorian magazines for mothers even circulated stories of squirrels who corrected impolite children. One tale recounted how a squirrel named Thistle would dramatically turn his back whenever young Thomas slurped his soup. After a week of silent protest, the boy adjusted his spoon to the edge of the bowl, and Thistle faced forward once more. Order, apparently, had been restored. There's something almost comically noble about a household so committed to manners that even its wildlife joined in. Yet there is also a warmth to it. The idea that learning can come not from scolding, but from shared, almost theatrical experience. Children weren't merely taught how to behave, they were given stories to remember, characters to admire, and furry friends to emulate. Of course, not all squirrels played along. Some launched peas across the room, gnawed on sugar cubes meant for guests, or leapt onto the ham with little regard for decorum. These rebellious rodents served their own lesson, that sometimes, despite our best training, nature has other plans. Still, for those few squirrels who performed flawlessly, waiting patiently, nibbling daintily, offering no loud squeaks, there was always the reward of applause, perhaps even a walnut in a silver dish. And for the children watching? A lifelong memory that good behavior could be learned from even the most unexpected teacher. As we shift from the dining table to the drawing room, a new scene unfolds, where squirrels weren't just dining companions, but evening entertainers. What tricks did they perform next, and how did their performances shape Victorian ideas of discipline and delight? As we drift further into the peculiar yet precise rituals of Victorian childhood, it's time we peek behind the doors of the nursery dining room, a space often governed with the strictness of a royal court, and amusingly, just as influenced by the presence of squirrels. Yes, squirrels. By now, you know these weren't just any bushy-tailed critters. These were socialized, trained, and, to the Victorian imagination, refined creatures. In many affluent homes, pet squirrels were present during children's mealtimes not as mascots, but as miniature moral tutors. Why? Because squirrels, when fed properly, eat with such delicate precision, holding food with both paws, chewing thoughtfully, and never wasting a crumb. To the Victorian nanny, this was a godsend. So at the child's side, a squirrel might sit on a velvet cushion, provided with its own tiny dish. Children were instructed to observe the animal's calm, focused movements. If you dropped your spoon, the squirrel didn't. If you chewed with your mouth open, the squirrel didn't. If you grew impatient and started tapping the table, the squirrel, again, didn't. In a strange twist of interspecies modeling, the squirrel became the gold standard of table decorum. In wealthier homes, the experience was even more theatrical. A well-dressed child might be served on miniature silver by uniformed nursery staff while a squirrel, yes, even sometimes in a tiny ruffled collar, ate alongside them. These moments were designed to teach restraint, grace, and most of all, discipline. Victorian society believed that children should not only behave but appear utterly composed, even while nibbling boiled vegetables. To reinforce good manners, children were awarded tokens or stars if they mimicked their squirrel's behavior successfully for the week. The opposite? Removal of privileges, no garden outings, no puppet shows, and worst of all, no contact with their favorite squirrel. And believe it or not, many children found this punishment unbearable. By linking social etiquette with emotional bonds, especially the bond with the beloved animal, the Victorians effectively made manners a matter of the heart. One mother wrote in her diary, "My Ada has finally learned to fold her napkin and not spill soup. Sophie the squirrel is quite the governess." The practice was unusual, yes, but effective in its own time and context. It blended empathy, play, and performance. And it reflected a broader Victorian obsession with natural order, where even animals were enrolled to reinforce the rigid expectations of social class and gender roles. The message was clear: if a squirrel could behave with elegance, surely a child could too. But squirrels weren't the only animals employed in this strange educational experiment. In the next chapter, we meet a new cast of characters: ferrets, finches, and yes, even hedgehogs, each given their own roles in the world of moral modeling. By the time the Victorian child had reached a certain age, usually 6 or 7, they were not just expected to keep their hands folded and back straight, but to internalize an entire moral universe, often one filtered through the trembling whiskers of a rodent. You see, it wasn't just that squirrels were cute or trainable. They became ethical mascots. If the squirrel sat still while the child practiced penmanship, the child was praised for being as patient as a beast of God's making. If the squirrel chewed through its little harness, the lesson was on restraint and discipline, followed by a somber discussion at the dinner table about the nature of freedom, obedience, and personal willpower. There were reports of children bursting into tears when their squirrel escaped, not simply because they missed their friend, but because they feared they had failed some unspoken moral test. "Mother, he left me," wrote one child in a diary from 1874, "because I was unworthy of his stillness." Some upper-class families even staged miniature, manus courts, child-led tribunals in which misbehaving siblings were judged by the standards of how their squirrel behaved that day. Was the squirrel calm during prayers? Did it nibble with dignity? Or did it act like a common rat? These mock trials, while comical by modern standards, served as elaborate training grounds for self-control, poise, and articulation. In one particularly extravagant household, the Gorsley family of Bath, each child wore a velvet sash color-coded to match their squirrel's weekly behavior. A blue ribbon week meant both child and squirrel had been perfect examples of Victorian modesty. A gray ribbon meant someone had failed to uphold the dignity of the drawing room. The punishments? Nothing more than extra practice in silence, posture, and eye contact. But perhaps most revealing of all were the journals, hundreds of pages of children's writings preserved in dusty trunks, filled with squirrel metaphors. One boy described his envy like, "A squirrel clawing inside my chest." Another said his laziness was, "A heavy tail I cannot lift." So what were these children really learning? Not just how to behave at dinner or write thank you notes, but how to translate raw emotion into symbols, gestures, and quiet performance. The squirrel was both mirror and mask. It reflected their moods while demanding composure. And in the silent gaze of those tiny eyes, many a child found the reflection of their own turbulent soul. As we tiptoe into the final years of the Victorian fascination with domesticated squirrels, we arrive at the twilight of their fashionable reign in nurseries and parlors alike. By the close of the 19th century, the squirrel, once a symbol of industriousness and high society whimsy, was beginning to lose its privileged seat by the hearth. The reasons were manifold, and most of them, surprisingly, had little to do with the squirrel itself. For one, the world was modernizing. The railway lines were thickening like veins across the British map, and the once romantic countryside was becoming parceled into plots and pastures. The rise of new technologies, and with it, new distractions, shifted children's attention elsewhere. Mechanical toys, tin soldiers with moving limbs, even wind-up birds that chirped on cue, became the preferred playmates of the nursery elite. Meanwhile, Queen Victoria herself, once an icon of domestic virtue, entered her later years draped in black, grieving and withdrawing from the public. Her tastes shifted towards solemnity and stoicism, and the public followed suit. The whimsy of squirrels, perching on shoulders, leaping across velvet couches, stealing ribbons, felt less aligned with the sober ethos of the time. Parents, too, grew weary. Though squirrels were clever, they were also unruly. Tales began to circulate in mothers' magazines of bitten fingers, shredded lace curtains, and little hands nipped by frustrated tails. A squirrel, after all, is not a doll, nor is it a trained hound. It was, even in its waistcoat and collar, still a creature of the wild. And so, gradually, the squirrel cages were replaced with bird cages or phonographs. Their tiny harnesses were folded and forgotten. No longer did governesses include squirrel etiquette in their morning lessons. Instead, they emphasized Latin declensions, piano scales, and deportment with umbrellas. But memories lingered. Some children, now adults, recalled those furry companions with quiet nostalgia. In journals and memoirs, they scribbled recollections of acorn and nutmeg, of cinnamon and thistle, their childhood squirrels with twitching noses and bushy tails that once wrapped lovingly around bedtime fingers. One aging gentleman, now a barrister, wrote in a letter to his sister, "Do you remember Pip? He once leapt onto father's top hat and would not let go. I believe father secretly adored him, though he pretended to scowl. Pip was the only creature who seemed immune to father's thunder." These were not just pets. They were partners in the theater of childhood, silent witnesses to first giggles and first scoldings, bearers of secrets whispered behind velvet drapes. And in that sense, they taught more than manners. They taught softness, responsibility, attentiveness, and perhaps, in a way few adults recognized, empathy. For how else could a child learn gentleness, if not from a creature small enough to perch in their hand, but spirited enough to leap away if mistreated? As we close this chapter, perhaps it's fitting to remember that history's oddest footnotes, like squirrels in silk collars, often say more about us than we realize. They reflect our dreams, our absurdities, our quiet needs for companionship in a world often too rigid for kindness. So if tonight you find yourself imagining a child in curls and buckled shoes, seated cross-legged beneath a sunbeam, feeding hazelnuts to a squirrel in a tiny bonnet, let that vision comfort you. Because, as ever, the past is full of tenderness, hidden in the strangest places. Now, where were we? Ah yes, just like that child with their squirrel, you've stayed with me this far. Thank you. And if your eyes are beginning to close, that's perfectly alright. The story has many more parts, but perhaps, for tonight, you've had just enough. Sleep gently now. And I'll see you in the next tale. And before you drift off completely, if this quiet little journey into squirrel-led etiquette brought you even a moment of peace tonight, consider tapping the like button. It helps more sleepy history lovers find their way here. If you want to join us again for more stories that go absolutely nowhere fast, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. No rush, we'll still be here when you're ready. Feel free to leave a comment, even if it's just where in the world you're listening from, or the name you'd give your own Victorian squirrel. And if there's someone in your life who could use a break from chaos, share this with them. Now, back to our squirrel-approved silence.